The step-by-step gathering in Topeka took place in a hall connected to Grace Cathedral, where the Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Kansas has their office. The Right Reverend Kathleen Chittenden Bascom became the first female to assume that role, being formally consecrated by the Most Reverend Michael Curry, presiding Bishop of the Episcopal Church, in March of 2019.
Be a faithful steward of God's holy word and sacrament. Now, Kansas, stand up and greet your new bishop and her family.
Our diocese, and that's the geographic region, is the eastern 40% of Kansas. There are 44 churches in the diocese, and the clergy are my flock in a way, and the parishes are my flock. And I interpret that responsibility isn't just to those churches.
Bishop Bascom considers each parish to be inclusive of the surrounding natural environment in which it exists, and she believes it's necessary to engage with issues that may sometimes be politically polarizing. Before she was elected bishop, she was appointed to a national task force on creation care developed by the Episcopal Church.
Earth stewardship, another way to talk about it, and care of creation, I think is actually less polarized than many things. That people of both and all political parties, many are engaged.
She has also been personally engaged with the international climate conferences organized through the United Nations.
The Episcopal Church had a delegation virtually to the Council of Parties, both COP26 and COP27. And out of that, a number of us who live in the Midwest region, we call ourselves the Great Middle. So we've been meeting virtually to just get people to come online and to hear more about the realities of climate change and the effects and the climate disasters and the changes. Just inviting people into conversation and trying to learn how to not hit hot buttons, but to say we respect one another. So to try to have that conversation, knowing how precious the earth is, and that this is what we call in religious terms a kairos moment, which means a holy and a time to get after it, that we are called in this moment to work on it.
In addition to encouraging such conversations, the bishop has developed a Creation Trustees Network.
It really grew out of a story of going to Blue Rapids and Marysville, where we have churches, and having time with one of our older members there, who I learned was from a church called St. Hilda's. And he pointed toward Tuttle Reservoir, and he said, well, St. Hilda's is there in the bottom. It was one of those towns that was taken. And that just really moved me. I was like, wow, St. Hilda's is at the bottom. And he was very concerned about Tuttle Reservoir silting in and what that's going to mean for all these communities in the Kansas River watershed. But so that kind of set me. So he is one of my creation stewards, somebody who, has land up in that region, was talking to me about things he was doing. If we can build this network of Episcopalians devoted to keeping their rangeland and not developing it, that's the kind of thing we're doing.
With a special affinity for tallgrass prairie, the bishop has demonstrated her understanding and appreciation of the important environmental role it plays with the publication of a novel based upon prior experiences in Iowa.
So when I was in Iowa, the 2008 flood occurred, and in downtown Des Moines, I was dean of the cathedral there, and I came to learn that, part of the reason that Iowa was suffering so much from flooding, it was climate change and what was going on in the atmosphere, but also that Iowa has only 1/1000th of its original tallgrass prairie left. So with losing all of that biomass under the earth. The rivers were flooding, and I could see in Des Moines that really see the suffering of people of least economic means. And often people of color are the ones who suffer most in those climate events, and was able to see that firsthand. And it came together with, this understanding that, wow, it's all interwoven. So that's Of Green Stuff Woven is the title. It comes from Walt Whitman, his famous Leaves of Grass, and that idea that humanity, what happens to whatever our environment is, the earth, the grasslands, happens to humanity.
In the aftermath of the flooding in Iowa, she says the decision was made to recreate a small prairie in downtown Des Moines to teach people about the role it plays in maintaining water quality and mitigating the impact of floods. When she assumed her new position in Kansas, she brought a version of that idea with her.
We've been trying to develop our land as well, right? So our 3 acres here, the diocese since 1860 has had a parcel of land here, and it used to be 20 acres. And now, Grace Cathedral's on it, Topeka High School is on the land. And, we are trying to be important stewards and just put in this urban green space with a teaching prairie, culinary garden, spiritual life garden, an outdoor chapel dedicated to the Episcopal African American Church that was closed in 1964. So remembering St. Simon's. But we are kind of the center of these other church properties. So we have 18 around the diocese that are on church lands, and trying to have church lands also, what can we do for biodiversity, for, water use? And what's been kind of cool is that sometimes it's the churches who are littler, fewer people, who've kind of, not been seen as the big heroes in much of the 20th century as these large urban churches are growing and lots of wealth. They suddenly see the riches they have environmentally, and are kind of some of our new heroes. They're putting in postage stamp prairies. They're able to do it, they're helping to clean various lakes, by what they're putting along the waterfront. Anyway, I think that's a wonderful story about kind of the last shall be first, and it's fun to see it. We have to do everything in our power as agents. That's what we're called to do, and that's what brings us alive. In terms of is it too late, I think that, say, with the Creation Trustees Network, we work toward mitigation. I think we still can have mitigating effect. Again, the grasslands are pretty important. I almost see the Flint Hills as a bit like our Amazon.
It covered a large portion of North America historically. It ranged from the Prairie Peninsula that stretched into Indiana and parts of Ohio, and then from Canada to Texas. So it was one of the largest, most significant grasslands in North America. And it's mostly gone. Most of it's been plowed to support the breadbasket of North America. And so only about 4% of the native prairie remains, and the largest portions of that are here in the Flint Hills of Kansas.
As with the Amazon's rainforests, the grasslands of the world have the capacity to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and store it underground, helping mitigate the impact of greenhouse gases on global warming. In the Flint Hills near Manhattan, Kansas, extensive research into the dynamics of prairie ecosystems has been carried out at the Konza Prairie Biological Station for more than 50 years, when the first of its 8,600 acres were acquired by the Nature Conservancy to serve as a field station for Kansas State University, with funds provided by prairie-loving philanthropist Catherine Ordway. A professor of biology at K-State, John Blair serves as the director of Konza Prairie.
when Kanza Prairie was first established, the three main topics that were focused on were fire, grazing by large ungulates, and climate variability. And the reason for that was that fire, grazing, and climate are the three major factors that we think historically were important in making this prairie what it is. So we looked at those early on in the program as the natural factors that determine the prairie, and we studied their influence on the plants and animal communities and ecosystem processes. But if you think about each of those are now directly impacted by human activity, either directly or indirectly. So humans control fire frequency and when and how frequent, what time of the year prairies burn. They've replaced bison with cattle grazing, and they're managed, so we manage the grazing system. And then the climate is changing because of anthropogenic influence as well. So all of those three major factors that were think about them as the natural drivers of the tallgrass prairie, are now influenced by humans. So over time, the research program has focused more and more on understanding how humans are changing the environment and how that influences the ecology of tallgrass prairies.
So let's talk about each of those three things, and let's start with what you've learned about grazing regimes for cattle.
Yeah, so just like most of the Flint Hills, historically this was managed for cattle grazing, which is still the predominant land use for the majority of tallgrass prairie in the Flint Hills. And the reason is that when the tall grasses grow in the spring, they're an incredibly nutritious food source for grazing animals, whether it's bison or cattle. And historically, ranchers recognized this, and cattle were often brought up from Texas and places south, and they would come up into the Flint Hills in the spring where they would graze for the season and put on a lot of weight. And so this was a working cattle ranch through the 1960s. And then in 1972, when the land was first acquired, for several years the land wasn't grazed at all then. Since then, we have reintroduced cattle to a portion of Kanza. We've reintroduced bison to another portion because we're very interested in how the native ungulates influence these grasslands. And there are parts of Kanza that are not grazed for comparative purposes as well.
So let's talk about bison then. What is the research that you're doing, and how does that relate to your broader mission here?
Yeah, so bison we think about them often as we think about them as a keystone species. They're one of the really important animals historically in tallgrass prairie that had a major role in determining plant community composition and the structure of the prairie, which then in turn influenced the diversity of insects and the diversity of birds and mammals. So they play a major role. We published a very recent paper that showed that over 30 years since we've introduced the bison here, one of the biggest effects that they've had is to increase plant diversity to almost double what the native prairie would be without the bison. And they do that mostly because they feed primarily on the dominant grasses. So the dominant tall grasses here are very good at using the resources in the soil and using sunlight, and they're very competitive in terms of their interaction with other plant species. When you introduce bison, they feed preferentially on those grasses, and they reduce the amount of grass biomass. They open up space that provides light for other plants. The bison also deposit dung and urine, which increases patches of nutrients, which favor other plants. So overall, they increase the heterogeneity and the patchiness of resources in the environment, and that leads to higher plant diversity.
So let's talk next about fire. What have you learned about fire and its role on the prairie from the work you've done here?
So the most important thing I would say about fire, and something that people who are not from this region don't understand, is that you don't have prairie if you don't have fire. Fire is absolutely essential to maintaining the tallgrass prairie. And the reason is that tallgrass prairies occur in areas where there's sufficient rainfall on average to support shrubs and trees. And shrubs and trees will grow in the absence of fire, and they'll displace the prairie. And we do controlled burns. So we do them under relatively low wind conditions, higher humidity, so that they are controllable. The problem with climate change and fires in places like tallgrass prairie is that as it gets drier, and as we go through extended periods of low humidity, low rainfall, the tallgrass prairies naturally produce a lot of fuel, which is highly flammable. And if those fuels ignite when they're really dry, when they're under windy conditions, those fires are really hard to control. So similar to fires out west, if you're not doing prescribed burning to control the vegetation and wildfires become more frequent, those wildfires can be pretty extensive and they can be very damaging. We had big fires out in central Kansas in Anderson County not long ago that demonstrated that. Another issue is, as we see the increase in woody vegetation, one of the plants that's increasing a lot in this region is eastern red cedar. And eastern red cedar, when it dries out, is highly flammable. And so we see big increases in those trees. And again, as we think about climate change in the future and drought conditions, which is going to lead to potentially a lot of flammable material, when those trees start to burn, those fires are much more intensive and much more difficult to control than grassland fires.
Let's talk about the third part of that then, which is the climate issue. Talk a little bit about the research related to climate and climate change that's going on out here.
Yeah, so we've always included climate as an important part of our research out here because, again, the prairies occur in the middle of the continent where the climate is naturally variable. What we have found is that the prairies are both sensitive to climate variability and they're fairly resilient within limits. Having said that, though, we're really concerned about what the impact of longer-term droughts and shifts in the timing of rainfall, which are predicted to be an important part of climate change for this region, what those will mean for not only the productivity of the prairie, but the diversity of plants and the diversity of animals here in the prairie. We've done some experiments on Kanza where we have altered the timing of rainfall to more closely mimic one of the climate predictions for the future, which is that we might not see large changes in rainfall here, but we'll see a repackaging of rainfall so that we see longer dry periods between rainfall events and then heavier rainfall when it does happen. And what we found is that even if you didn't change the amount of rainfall, if you just repackaged it that way, it was as significant as about a 30% reduction in rainfall. In other words, it's like a moderate drought. So from a ranching perspective, I would be concerned because what that would mean is that even if the amount of rainfall doesn't change, but we get this shift to longer dry periods and bigger storms, that rainfall is going to be less effective in terms of supporting the prairie, and it's going to reduce the growth of plants here, which ultimately means reduction in grass production and reduction in forage for cattle, for example. So there are definitely concerns about what future climates will mean for the prairie in terms of its sustainability.
Talk a little bit about the role of the prairie in terms of carbon sequestration, because I know that's an issue that folks talk about.
Yeah. So the prairies, the soil of the prairies is remarkable because it is so carbon rich. I mean, that's one of the things that made it so valuable for agriculture, because along with that carbon and organic matter, there are stored a lot of nutrients below ground in organic matter as well. And that's what made them so fertile and so profitable for farming. For the intact native prairies, they're storing, almost all the carbon is stored below ground. In fact, if you burn a prairie, the carbon that's above ground is released in the smoke back to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And some people ask, well, is that a good or bad thing? Aren't you just releasing all the carbon above ground? But what you have to remember is that burning the prairie increases productivity in the subsequent year. It increases the growth of the plants both above and below ground in the next year. So those plants in the next year just produce more carbon, and the important thing is much of that carbon is shuttled below ground. These prairies have extensive roots. The carbon that they're capturing goes not only into leaves, it gets pumped below ground into the roots, and the roots also exude carbon. They leak carbon into the soil, which is used by microbes, and all of that carbon below ground gets incorporated into the soil organic matter. A lot of people ask about, is the prairie storing a lot of carbon now? Because clearly it has in the past. And based on our measurements, a well-managed prairie essentially takes up as much carbon dioxide as it's losing in a contemporary year. In other words, the prairies, a well-managed prairie is basically carbon neutral. It's not currently an active carbon sink. It's not a carbon source. Where I think there's a real potential to sequester a lot of carbon is in prairie restoration, is in prairies that were either mismanaged or marginal lands that were historically plowed that are now being planted back into prairies. Because when you plant perennial grasses back into those prairies, you start rebuilding those stores of soil carbon that were lost when the prairie was plowed or mismanaged or overgrazed. So I think by focusing on how we manage our prairies and by taking marginal lands and restoring them back to native grassland, we have the tremendous potential to increase carbon sequestration in those areas.
One of the things that you hear among some folks that talk about climate change is, well, the world has always been changing, and you've documented change out here, so what's the big deal? Okay, this is just more of the same, isn't it?
It's not more of the same, and I teach a general ecology class, and climate change is a theme that runs throughout that class, partly because climate is so important and always has been in terms of being one of the major factors that influences the ecology of any ecosystem, but also because of the contemporary changes in climate. So yes, the climate has changed in the past, and we know that it's done that over scales of millennia, over millions of years. So I've been teaching at Kansas State University for 30 years. 30 years ago, the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration was about 320. It's 412 now. That is an incredible change over a short period of time. For millions of years, the carbon dioxide level was nowhere near where it's at now. So the two things that I think are the biggest factors to consider is that the environment is changing in ways that we haven't seen over literally hundreds of millions of years. And it's changing at a rate that's just unprecedented. And the third thing is that these changes are clearly linked to human activity. There aren't natural sources of carbon dioxide that are leading to this change. We can link them clearly to the burning of fossil fuels primarily, and to land use changes secondarily. So we know what the causes are. We're getting a better and better idea of how ecosystems are going to respond to these changes. I think the only thing that we seem to be lacking at the moment is the political will to do something about it.